Hello everyone and welcome to the Bluegrass Unlimited magazine weekly bluegrass music podcast. Bluegrass Unlimited is a monthly publication of the Bluegrass Music Hall of Fame and Museum located in Owensboro, Kentucky. Learn more at bluegrasshall.org. I'm your podcast host, Dan Miller. This week I'm talking with banjo master Butch Robbins. Butch has had a very long and distinguished career in bluegrass music and was famously a member of Bill Monroe and his Bluegrass Boys. He played with Monroe very briefly right out of high school in the 1960s and then went back to perform with Monroe in the late 70s and early 1980s. Butch will share with us his always insightful perspective about Bill Monroe and bluegrass music, and I will talk with Butch about his biographical book and a very interesting video series about the history of bluegrass that was produced for Radford University. Those of you who are familiar with this podcast know that right up front I usually welcome my guest prior to the first question. When I got Butch on the phone, we went directly into talking about subjects of interest, so I pressed record and let it fly without an introduction. So we're going to roll right into the interview part of the podcast, and you'll hear Butch talking about putting his book together right off the bat. Here we go.
You know, my illusion of all this stuff in retrospect is I have to wonder about it at times. Because it was like when I was writing my book, you know, when I wrote about a bunch of the incidents in that book that I wrote about, I tried to contact as many people who were involved in those incidents as I could and get their version of the story, you know.
Yeah.
And a lot of times in memory of 10, 15, 20 years there, other people remembered things a different way than I did.
Yeah.
Well, the weird thing about it was I kept journals. When I went back and started looking at the journals, sometimes my memories deviated just as much as theirs did. So that's why, all this stuff, and I have a composite view of what I think bluegrass music was.
Uh-huh.
And then on the other side of it, I've just got this composite view of what I perceive to be, string band music out there.
Right.
That's gone through these stages, whether it was in Roy Acup's era. I was talking with a guy named Richard Brown from Boston. He's a retired dentist up there. He's a mandolin player. And they got on this deal this year to give a scholarship in the name of Arnold Schultz. He was the black guitar player that was, in that Kentucky era where he was up there. And I called him up and I said, Richard, if you're looking for black influence in Bill Monroe's music, if Bill Monroe had left Rosine and gone to Nashville, Tennessee, he had wound up in being in a band that would have been reminiscent of the Fruit Jar Drinkers.
Yeah.
But he didn't. He went to Chicago and he got exposed to the black jazz music of Chicago. He got exposed to bands that were out there. When individuals took solos, they stood up in the bandstand so they could be recognized while they're doing that. That's the same thing he did when he went to the Grand Ole Opry, of bringing his individual soloist up to center mic.
Right.
To let him stand out. He was the first one that ever did that. And I think he got that little push to the backbeat that he had, that rhythmic push that he had to the backbeat of stuff. And I explained that in the rhythm, that section where it may have been in the fourth hour of the video or something like that, or the fourth one, where I was talking about timing,
Right.
And breaking that down into the aspect of it, which is just simply the pace or the tempo, 120 beats a minute, 2 beats a second, period.
Yeah, right.
That's what that is. That's mechanical, But when you get to that rhythmic feel the rhythmic life that you give that tune, the heartbeat you give it out there, how do you apply that to the tempo? You put it just a little shade ahead of it, right on top of it, a little bit behind it.
Right.
The same thing with the lead work. If you Ruggs' stuff out there, you'll find he consistently played 5 to 10 milliseconds in front of the beat.
Mm-hmm.
But he had a bass player that could hold tempo for him.
Yeah.
And there was a sound there. It just had a sparkle. The only other person I ever saw that could do that is a guy named Larry Perkins, a banjo player. But he had the ability to do that, just play just a fraction ahead and still not rush.
Well, the interesting thing, and I loved your explanation on the video about time and and the way you broke it down and drew it out on the back of that poster. And one of the things you said, a lot of people think, I feel that a lot of people think that Monroe always played ahead of the beat, but you said sometimes it was ahead, sometimes it was dead on, and sometimes it was behind, depending on the song.
Yeah, I mean, it was just he had just a way of doing things. If we were playing, go along and play Road to Columbus or something like that, not the Golden West, but the Gold Rush.
Uh-huh.
Some of those, he'd be right dead nuts on the beat.
Yeah.
If it were Molly and Ten Brooks, he'd push it just a little bit. Get into the breakdowns like Bluegrass Breakdown and Rawhide, he'd push it a lot.
Uh-huh.
Turn right around and do Dark as the Night and Blue as the Day, and he'd play behind it.
Right.
He'd pull at it.
Yeah.
It would pull at itself.
Yeah. You were saying that Kenny Baker would play pretty much right on the beat?
He played right on the beat, and the funny thing about him was he played to a 4/4 timing signature while Bill was playing to a 2/4.
Yeah.
And if it didn't meter out in a 4, if there was a loose measure of 2 hanging out there on the end of his counting, he made up a lick. I'll show you. You know the old song that we used to do, Working on the Building?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, you got that first part. Da 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 da. What is it? That'd be the first part.
Right.
When Kenny would get to the second part of it, it was. So Monroe called me one time in the dressing room, and he said, "You need to play that melody like Kenny Baker does on some song that we were doing." And I said, "Well, Bill, Kenny don't always play the lead line. He don't always melody. He's got cliche licks he uses when it doesn't meter out to him." "Well, you don't know what you're talking about," and he just walked out of the room. So the next time we did Working on the Building on the stage, Kenny kicked it off pretty much like I showed you there. And we got up and we sung the first verse and chorus, and I stepped back to do my break, and it was. To finish the line out.
Yeah.
And Bill was the only one that caught me. The second time I did it, first time I did it, he fumbled on it a little bit. Second time, his chords were right with me.
Huh.
So I look over my left shoulder, and Bill used to be a wonderful bass singer. He used to have Pete Coram, that fellow that just passed away here last month, used to have him when he was in James's band come up and sing tenor so he could sing bass.
Huh.
And he had this really interesting way of singing bass, like if it were on, he would set your fields on fire. You're used to that bass line. If you don't from sin retire, he will set your fields on fire.
Yeah.
Go down like that. Monroe would say, if you don't from sin retire, he will set your fields on fire.
Huh.
And push it up into the 5 chord there, And it was just really odd. But anyhow, I played that Working on a Building, For My Lord, ending on that. And I just looked over my left shoulder. I said, now there's your melody. And he came out with the lowest sound I ever heard him make in a bass voice. He just said, yeah. And the next thing I heard was like 2 octaves above it going, if I was a preacher. Yeah. If I was a preacher.
That's good.
It was funny as all get out. And he never did say nothing to me about melody again.
Huh.
That was the only thing. He never told me, said a thing to me about how to play anything. And we stayed at odds a lot. He just didn't like the way I lived my life back then. And that was the greatest compliment Baker ever paid me was I got to where I would talk with him for extended periods on the phone.
Yeah.
And he told me once upon a time that I was the only banjo player that Bill ever had, that Bill didn't constantly come to him bitching about the banjo player. That was one of the compliments I ever got.
Well, that's great. So is your book still available?
Yeah.
And you want to tell the folks a little bit about it? And I guess you did it back in, 2003, something like that?
Yeah, I was in sort of my mid-50s, I think. I spent about 2 years feeling like I was sitting on a psychiatrist's couch doing that. And so...
Yeah, I mean, it's a wonderful book, and it's got great perspectives on stuff. It tells your life story, but it also gives, you give the story of things as the way you see it. And I think it's a wonderful read for anybody who's interested in bluegrass music, because you have some unique perspectives about stuff, and you have things to say about people you knew and people you worked with that, a lot of people may not know about. So, yeah, can they buy it?
Well, I stepped on a lot of people's heroes' feet of clay in that thing. So, I have real mixed. I don't know that I would do it if it came again. If it came up again to do it, I would do it the same way. I might try to take more time in the editing process of it, but I would have done that myself. The way it started out, I just spoke for 24 hours into a tape recorder. I made 16 90-minute tapes.
Wow.
And then they had the stuff transcribed for me. When they had it transcribed, I put it all in chronological order. And after I put it in chronological order, I went back and started actually trying to write a book out of it.
I see.
And some of it, I might have 10 pages there that would reduce itself to 2. In other places, I'd have 2 pages that would expand into 10 when I started doing it.
Okay.
So when I finished it up, I had 300 and some odd pages to it. And for the money constraints, there was a self-publishing deal on my part, because everything that I've done except for my rounder stuff now, I own.
Uh-huh.
Because sooner or later, Dan, I'm going to be discovered. But anyhow, and hopefully be able to take care of some of my folks with that. But anyhow, I went back and done that. Then when I found out the constraints were I wanted to keep the paperback somewhere in the 20 to 25 range and the hardbacks in the 30 to 35 range, I had to reduce it to like 220 pages or something like that.
Yeah.
Which I did. I cut somewhere around 100 pages out of it.
Wow.
And then I went back and started writing on it. And I remember it was the day before my 55th birthday. And it had been like 2 years, like I said, of being on a psychiatrist's couch. And I wrote that part about quitting Monroe.
Yeah.
Throwing that damn massive fit on him that I threw down there. And I got through with that thing. It was like 4 o'clock on a Sunday morning, 5 o'clock. And I stuck a sock. I fell out of my chair. I stuck a sock in my mouth so I wouldn't wake other folks up in the house. And just laid there crying until about 7 o'clock when I called a friend of mine who was a clinical psychologist, and he could talk me out of that tree that I was in at that point.
Yeah, that's...
And I just said, this is too much.
Yeah.
And I just went down to the publisher and I said, this is it. This is the way it's going to be. Do your layout. And they said, you want it edited? And I said, no, they want my words. They get my words. They wanted me to tell my tale. I don't want somebody flower, It's the way I talk. It's what I saw, and I'm going to pass that along as best I can.
Yeah, well, I think in the book and the video series that you did for Radford University, you're very candid and you tell it like it was, and I really appreciated all that. And can you talk about how the video series came about? I mean, you tell a lot of the same stories, but you also on the video series, are able to put musical clips on there, which I think is really nice.
Yeah, it took us almost 2 years to get that to be able to be done. We had to have the state attorney general sign off on it.
Oh, really? Wow.
When I originally did it, the guy that was with the McConnell Library back then, Bud Bennett, came up to my house. He had been taking some banjo lessons from me, and he wanted to do a video on me. Later on, did one on Sammy Sheeler, one on Jens Kruger, and other folks out there. But I said, they ain't that much to say about me in this whole thing, and what I know about banjo playing, you can fit in a shoebox. But I said, I do know about bluegrass music.
Yeah.
So he talked with the folks down there, and they set it up. And I had done this presentation before. The only other time that I'd done it in its entirety had been actually in Australia.
Huh.
And I had 93 people sitting in seats at 9 o'clock in the morning. And at 1 o'clock that afternoon, about 1:30 when I finished, I still had 92 of them there.
Huh.
When I did the thing. So I knew, pretty much what I wanted to do. And I told the guys with the cameras when they come in, I just said down first, I said, okay, fellas, we're going to go from from the beginning up till about 1939 today. So I gave them all the history that I knew of Monroe, up to that time. And then after the night, okay, fellas, we're going 1939 through 1949 today.
Okay.
1949 through 59. And that's the way we did it. Was a notice, because I didn't have any script for this thing. I mean, I'm sort of making it up as I go,
Yeah.
And anyhow, when it came time to get those sound clips in the thing, the way that they tried to do it was you had to be a Radford University. You had to have a student ID card to get in to view them.
Okay.
And I put up a fuss about that, and they went to the state attorney general, and finally he signed off on it and gave us, I think, 20 seconds that we could put in there at them. And every time I talked to anybody, I encouraged them. I said, folks, these clips just came right off of YouTube. Go out and listen to the whole thing, to listen to how the music was forming and shaping during that era.
Yeah. Yeah, and for folks that don't know, they can get to the video series, and there's 4 main segments, and then you did another segment about bluegrass traveling around the world and jam session type things, and it's on. There's links to it from your website, butchrobbins.com, right?
I think so. I think Joanne's got all that stuff splattered out all over everywhere. So
yeah, it's very a great historical view of bluegrass music, and you put a lot of really great information out there. Not only stories that are unique to you, but perspectives, whether you lived it or someone who did live it told you about it. It's a lot of really great information. One of the things I liked, Butch, is that you brought up some guys that you had high esteem for that, may not have been as famous as others. Everybody knows about the real famous guys, the Bill Monroe and the Osborne brothers and the Stanley brothers and Jim and Jesse and Flatt and Scruggs and all that. But there are some guys that you brought up, like specifically about Rudy Lyle's banjo playing and the way it kind of, you felt it fit Monroe's music. Can you tell us about that?
yeah, I mean, I think his was a real cryptic right hand. You can hear it, it doesn't have that fluid quality to it. When you hear the beginning of his break on Rawhide, you can really hear the way he went after things, and I thought he had a style, the stuff that he did on Sugar Coated Love, or whether it was on the break of Rawhide or any of that stuff, and for the era he was in, I thought he came up with some real neat ideas. Back in that day and time when Monroe would write a bluegrass instrumental. I've made the statement often that when Bill Keith came in the band, the actual scope of the music as an art form diminished. Because all of a sudden you had the banjo playing what the fiddle was playing, what the mandolin was playing.
Oh, I see.
And instead you go back into those early instrumentals, and it was basically you played on a structure. Whether it was wheelhouse. Hubert Davis actually played 3 parts to wheelhouse.
Right.
When you got to that end of the two parts that everybody played, Rudy Lyle the same way with Rawhide. There was no way his break did not emulate anything that Monroe did or the fiddle player did. He just played through that E A D G chord pattern right in the part in the middle where the stops were.
Yeah.
And it was all different back then. And the nature of the instrumentals was different. That's why I developed it into a primal era, which I said was going through its death throes somewhere about 1958, 59. I mean, Monroe's bubble had bust at that point.
Yeah.
But then when Ralph Rensler came down, renegotiated all his stuff with Decca Records, put his business stuff in order and all that, and then Carlton Haney came along with the Bluegrass festivals, all of a sudden, and the music, you had Bill Keith coming in there, Monroe getting clued into the fact, here's another banjo style out there, because it was just as dynamic as when Earl came on. So Farron Young got Bill Keith to come back out and play Sailor's Hornpipe for him.
Uh-huh.
And the whole thing that happened there not long after that, here you got Richard Green and Peter Rowan come in the band. Richard Green out there, Stephen Grappelli said he was the greatest jazz violinist the North American continent had produced.
Yeah.
Out there. And all of a sudden, Monroe realizing that he can get back on that musical high horse through the intricacies of old-time fiddle music.
Yeah, interesting.
Because that's what he had been on. He had been on that high horse his whole career down there ever since 1939.
Yeah.
He was like the jazz man of the Grand Ole Opry. Well, by 1957, 58, Ray Price had a hell of a band out there. The Cherokee Cowboys. Ernest Tubb had a band that was a dynamite band underneath him, and all the rest of these guys too. So they had sort of shot Monroe out of that high horse saddle he was on. All of a sudden, when he comes back with this real complex music in the 60s, and it's a whole different slant on music than what he had been doing in the 40s and 50s.
Yeah.
And still the songs, and just, I mean, the talent that he got around him, those of us who became his dream partners. For guys who think if Pete Rowan thinks he wrote Waltz of Time or Byron Berline thinks he wrote Gold Rush, my question to them is, where's your other? Pete Rowan's written some of the most brilliant songs in the world. I think one of his songs, Thirsty in the Rain, is just, it reduces me to tears every time I hear it. But they ain't nothing got that dark haunting. The wind is blowing across the mountains down on the valley far way below. It sweeps the grave of my darling. When I die, that's where I want to go. Yeah. Lord, steering the angels from our. Nothing has that dark thing right there that has.
Right. Yeah, he definitely.
And that was just, and I explained that was the psychologist I was telling you about how talking me down. He dealt with children who had issues,
Right.
And a lot of times those troubled children, he would put them in pairs, and they would become each other's dream partners, and they would share their dreams with one another and get, that information out on the table that could be worked with that way.
Okay.
And that's what I said somewhere. I made the statement that in Monroe's creative process, all of us, whether it was me or Tony Ellis or anybody, you'd be sitting up there in front of the bus and you'd play something and have an odd little twist to it. He'd do that again. He'd pick up a mandolin and he'd thumb around on it a little bit to where he found something that emulated that, and he'd add a little bit to it, and he'd say, now add a little bit to that, and you just interacted with him there.
Right.
We were like dream partners in that process, and it don't matter whether it was Tony Ellis was able to play old Joe Clark like no other banjo player Bill ever had for him, or what it was. We were just part of the process there, and that's one thing that I shut down my banjo world while I was with the Newgrass Revival, because I was always picking up on everything I would hear from everybody back in those days. I think Courtney Johnson was one of the most brilliant banjo players I ever met, especially for somebody who didn't even start playing until he's 27 years old. He was absolutely brilliant, but I didn't want to sound like him, so I didn't play the bass. Well, it was the same way with Monroe. the whole time I worked for him, I never wrote anything.
Well, and also just going back a minute to Newgrass, when you were in Newgrass Revival, in the book you talked about how good you thought Curtis Butch was as a dobro player. And I think, he may be underrated in that world because he was such a phenomenal player,
Well, I saw Curtis 2 times. He stopped my world. The thing, I was living near Asheville, North Carolina, and we'd gone down to that fall festival they had there, the Hubert Hayes or Baskin Lamar Lunsford. One of them put on the youth thing in the spring, and the other one put on the thing for adults in the fall.
Okay.
And I had that was the first contest I had won, was in the spring there. So I go to the fall one, and I meet all these people. That's where I met Taylor, Mike Longsworth, Roger Sprung, Harry and Jeannie West, all those instrument traders back from those days.
Right.
The Longsworth had that RB4 there that he had bought from Earl, that Earl recorded Ground Speed with.
Oh, right, yeah.
And he said he had paid Earl $750 for the banjo, and then had about $1,000 engraving job done on it. I remember that was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen.
Wow.
But anyhow, I'm sitting around there talking to them and, trying to get to know them. I'm just a young and all excited about their playing and dealing and all this stuff. So everybody started gathering around in this big group around the back of this one car there. And I went over and wormed my way up, and there's Curtis Butch sitting there. And he was probably 5 or 6 years older than me. I don't know, somewhere along that. He may have still been in high school. But he sat there and played. I saw him bending the strings behind the bar, the techniques that Mike Aldridge and Gary Douglas made famous, and all that other stuff.
Right.
And he sat there and played stuff. There was nothing that Josh Graves played that he couldn't play inside out.
Yeah.
And I sat there with my jaw hanging open for about an hour and listened to that guy. Because that was the first thing I started out on, was dobro.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, my dad, a guy called my dad from West Virginia, wanting him to find a dobro and a banjo for his children. He wanted to play, and my dad found a dobro in Spartanburg down there in a pawn shop for $5 and had a broken neck in it. Daddy brought it home and put the neck back in the thing. Called up a guy, and the guy came get it, but until the guy came down there and got it, Daddy had gone out and bought one of those little old Stephen Steele bars.
Mm-hmm.
And I could play Fireball Mayo on that dobro by the time they got there,
Oh, wow.
So anyhow, when they got there, all of a sudden, when I saw the first banjo, the first one I ever saw was an old recording game that a guy named Paul Barton had down near Lebanon, Virginia. And we kept on going around, and finally, I was working in a barber shop. I'd sweep the place out after school every day, and then all day on Saturday, and I could do what I could do with shoe shines in there. And some guy brought in an old banjo. It was the banjo that I used when I was making those golf swings.
Oh, yeah.
In there. Daddy bought that old banjo and sewed the head up with fishing line. The head on it was busted.
Yeah.
And we got it to where you could put a bridge on it and get strings on it and get it tuned up and everything. And then we found a guy named Homer Israel that could do a halfway decent roll out there. And I started learning the roll from him. And my dad knew enough about guitar and mandolin that he could transpose around on the neck, and he figured out how to show me the major chord structures on the neck and where they were and all of that. And when I'd been playing about 6 or 8 months, I guess, they bought me a banjo. I looked at it the other day, and I carved in the back of it December 20th, 1962.
Huh.
Was when I got it.
It looked like on the video that one still had that torn head on it. You never replaced the one that your dad fixed up?
No, man, that thing's almost unplayable. It was terrible. But it got me started. I made this, after I got that, and got it in the hands, I made this little block of wood and put rubber bands on it that were spaced out like string.
Uh-huh.
And I could put it on my lap or on my leg underneath my desk at school and sit there and practice those rolls. Doing that and figure out a rhythm and a timing to it. It always, when I first started doing it, I kept seeing this little puppy dog walking down the road, just hopping a little dachshund or something like that, just trotting down the road.
Okay.
That's what finger roll sounded to me like.
Ah.
And then I'd get others, and it was real funny. That's when I started. We were on that Newgrass revival thing. When I was in that band, I learned the difference between listening and hearing.
Okay.
When you play in a group where everybody listens to everybody else, you find that you're constantly playing behind yourself.
Huh.
Because there's the lag time there.
Okay.
You need to hear. Monroe heard, but he didn't listen. He heard the overall sound that was coming out, but he did not listen to the individual parts. When you start listening to other people's individual parts on stuff, you're going to wind up playing behind them.
Okay.
That's just a natural thing that happens out there. So
yeah, that makes sense.
Anyhow, that's what that is.
Huh. Tell me about you were playing with Newgrass, but around that time you also went on tour with Leon Russell, and then Newgrass also did that as well. Can you talk a little bit about your experiences with Leon?
I did. Tut Taylor came into the picking parlor down there one morning and told me to get the old 5-string dobro that he had gotten from the Dupera brothers.
Uh-huh.
And we were going out to a studio. And I didn't even know what it was all about. He told me on the way out there we were going to be recording for a guy named Leon Russell. And I'd never heard of him. So we get out there to Bradley's barn and everything, and Tut, we go in and meet him. And Tut got me to play that dobro, and he said, yeah, we can use that on this. So they set me down in there. When I was, and I didn't attend high school as much as I should have. A lot of times I'd just stay home and play the banjo.
Uh-huh.
And I had a pretty decent running deal up there as long as I kept my grades up, and I finished like 94, 95 average through high school, so I was good there. But, I didn't necessarily have to come to school.
Uh-huh.
I had members on both sides of me that I had all my classes with. As long as I kept my classwork up, I was in good shape.
Okay.
So this high school principal called me out in the hall one day, and he said, Butch, you're a big fish in a little pond around here. You said you're smart enough you can do this work, but you don't step outside of it to do any extra and everything. He said, I just don't understand you, And I said, well, I'm probably going to wind up being a musician. He said, well, one of these days you're going to walk out in a room where everybody in that room is just as smart as you are. And before you leave that room, somebody's going to show you how smart you ain't. And I just sort of hee-haw laughed it and walked on down the place. Well, here I am about 4 or 5 years after that, and I'm in one of those sessions in there. And I think we had done one tune, but Uncle Penn was there to be had. And that was the next tune that was coming up. So he done the run-through with everybody. We did about 2 or 3 run-throughs, and he liked to get everything on the first or second cut.
Okay.
Of what it was. So anyhow, going into the second chorus on the thing, people say da 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 da. Go into a heavy seventh there.
Okay.
I did this. Do it.
Yeah.
I played that note twice in the chords of rolls going in there before I go into the 4 chord, which was the D.
Okay.
We were playing at A. We get through with that. Leon looks around. He's down on one corner of the room, down to my right. Then up the wall there come Ray Eddington, Bobby Thompson playing the banjo, Tut Taylor playing the regular dobro, me playing that 5-string dobro. In front of me was a slap bass player, Lightning Chance, I think is who it was, a drummer, drum cage, down the other wall on the other side, Jim Buchanan, and that great Texas Gimbal, Johnny Gimbal.
Okay.
2 girls singing over on the other corner there, and a piano right out in front of the room. And I'm playing an instrument there that we have to stick an SM57 microphone inside of to be able to hear it.
Mm-hmm.
It was a lot like playing an electric guitar with no amplifier.
Okay.
A thin body, 5-string dobro. We get through with Uncle Pen, that first run down on it. Leon looks up and says, "What'd y'all think about that?" And everybody, man, it's good, had a good feel to it. And he said, "Yeah, it had a good feel. It was rocking all the way through. We need to do it again just like that." Pointed over to Buchanan and them over there and said, "If you guys would build it just a little bit more on the end to a little more of a crescendo there." And he said something else. And he pointed right up that wall to me. And he said, "Young man, you can leave those 2 F notes off before we go into that second chorus."
Wow.
And there I was standing in front of Jimmy Painter. One of these days you're going to walk into a room where everybody in that room's just as smart as you are. And before you leave that room, somebody's going to show you how smart you ain't. Leon showed me how smart I wasn't. And I wound up going out and partying around for about 3 or 4 days with a guy named Les Blank, who was videoing all this stuff. He was a videographer, great filmmaker, and everything. If you could see any of his documentary work on Clifton Chenier or any of that other stuff, it's all just wonderful.
Okay.
He was filming all Leon stuff back then. So we're sitting down in Tootsie's one day drinking a beer. We've made our way up and down both sides of Broadway out there. And he said, "Let's go to Tulsa." "What for?" "Let's go see Leon." "I don't know Leon." "Don't matter. I got his credit card." It's out a credit card. So we wound up jumping on a plane within 3 or 4 hours, and we're headed to Tulsa. I got my banjo with me. I ain't even got a toothbrush, a change of underwear, or nothing. So here we're gone. And to make a long story short, about 4 or 5 days after I got out there, Leon came down early one afternoon, came walking down the steps into the kitchen there and said, "You think you can put together a band for me that front my show so I could play some of them things on that, Roll My Sweet Baby's Arms and some of that stuff?" And I said, "Yeah, I can do that." I said, "Give me a little bit."
Yeah.
So I went out and found a phone and I called Sam Bush. And I said, "Do you want to go to work for Leon Russell?" And he said, "Well, I'm in this new Grass Revival thing." I said, "Sam, I know that and all." I said, "This is for the whole band. The only kicker is you've got to take me along because I ain't never been around nothing like this in my life."
Uh-huh.
So he told me to call Keith Case out in Denver, and I called Keith, and Keith cleared their schedule for them so they could do it. And we went on that first tour with Leon. And I actually quit a month before the tour was over. I had another job to go through because all I was doing was freelancing back in them days.
Yeah.
So anyhow, I go there. The next thing I know, I'm out at the Harry James Phil Harris show out in Las Vegas. And my dad had told me I needed to try to play with Clarence White. My dad never did like lead guitar players, but he heard Clarence White up here at Indian Springs, Maryland. He thought he was the greatest thing since sliced bread.
Yeah.
So he told me to do that. I said, "All right, get me a phone number. Call Pete Kuykendall. Get me a phone number. I'll call him." And before I head back to Nashville, I said, "I got about 10 days left out here. And before I go back to Nashville, I'll go to L.A. and see if I can, work out something with him."
Yeah.
And I called him about 3 or 4 days later. I said, "Dad, I ain't got a phone number, and it's coming to end of time out here." He said, "It's all a moot point now. Clarence was killed a couple of nights ago in L.A.
Wow.
Somebody got him." And the next day, Sam Bush called and said, "We're firing Ebo," because he had asked me if I wanted the job while we were out. And I said, "Man, I'm not a bass player,
Right.
And he called and said, we're firing Ebo, and, we got to have somebody to fill in for us for a while."
Right.
And said, material and could get through it. So I went there, and my first job was at Reedsville, and we went from there to Blues Festival, went from there to Winfield, Kansas.
Okay.
And anyhow, the next year when we played Reedsville, I started a thing called the Pat Mahoney Fan Club out there that everybody got a big kick out of.
Right.
And then I worked for him for 3 or 4 months after that. But it seems in all the Newgrass stuff out there, my role was diminished for I worked for him a couple of months.
Oh, right.
So anyhow, I don't know how it came to be like that, but at least they did put my name on something when they put them in the Hall of Fame.
Well, your dad was friends with Bill Monroe as well, right?
Yes, my dad was the biggest Bill Monroe nut that ever was. I mean, me playing for Monroe the way I did, I was basically living out my dad's dreams for him.
Yeah.
When I was a little guy, we'd go to my granddaddy's house. My dad had every Charlie and Bill Monroe 78 that there was, and that's all he would play when we would go up to my granddad's house. He would just play their music.
Yeah.
And he met Bill up here in Roanoke when Carlton Haney took me to Bill played for the opening of the Melrose Shopping Center in Roanoke, Virginia.
Okay.
And Carlton got me to come to that. And Carlton told this story on something he did, some TV show he did in Nashville where they took him down there. I don't remember it this way, but he told me he got me the tryout for Bill Monroe. And he said I was 18, but the reality was I was 15 then.
Uh-huh.
And he said, I got my banjo out and started playing for Bill, and I played something like Earl Scruggs, and Bill looked at me and said, well, I wouldn't play that like that.
Ah.
Oh, okay. So I come back with him with something like Don Reno would have played. Bill looks at me and says, I don't believe I'd have played that like that. So I started with a couple others, maybe Sonny Osborne, Bill Emerson. You know, I was big fans of theirs back in that day and everything. Everything I do, Monroe, I don't believe I'd play that way. Well, how should I play it? He said, well, the first thing you do is learn everything them other guys did, and then don't do it.
All right.
And that was what, you know, when I saw Carlton, the first time I ever saw him, he asked me what I want to do. I said, I want to be a great banjo player. He said, well, that's simple. Just learn how to play your banjo the way Bill Monroe plays his mandolin.
Ah.
And that's what I spent my career trying to do.
Yeah.
The scope of that old man's prowess on a mandolin.
Yeah. Tell us about you were in high school and your dad sort of made an arrangement with Bill that he wanted you in the band, but your dad said you needed to finish high school, and then when you graduated, he sent your diploma to Bill, and Bill called you to come work for him. Is that how it was?
Well, that was after that first Fincastle Festival. See, Lamar Greer was just sort of trying out for the job during that festival.
Okay.
And I thought I had a chance of getting it, and it wasn't going to happen. My dad and Bill had talked, and, you know, my dad was adamant that I was going to finish school.
Okay.
So we go back home. My dad sent Bill a graduation announcement. And I got a call from him. I was working in a little old laundry and dry cleaners, delivering clothes and stuff. And it was a Saturday morning. He called me I guess it was about 2 or 3 weeks before I finished high school. And asked me if I wanted to come to work for him on the Grand Ole Opry. And I was just, you know, yeah.
Yeah.
So be down to Nashville, Tennessee, such and such a day. And it was like the week right after I graduated from high school. So I went down there and wound up working the first Bean Blossom Festival, and the only White Castles I got exposed to were the ones where you can get them 19-cent burgers. So
yeah,
it didn't seem like I came back up here and went to school for a couple of years trying to dodge the draft. It didn't work. They got me in 1969 anyhow.
So you graduated in what, 67?
Yes, sir.
And you went to work with Monroe for that summer?
No, I wound up being with him less than a month.
Oh, I see. And then you talked something about, what was it, the next summer he invited you to just go out with the band and ride the bus?
Yeah, they came up to me. I didn't go back to Bean Blossom. My dad didn't go the first year, and I didn't go the second year.
Uh-huh.
In the third year, I went up there, and I remember I was just around picking with people out in the park, you know, and stuff like that. And both Bill and my dad come to me and said, we got a banjo contest and we ain't got nobody to enter it. Said, would you come participate in the banjo contest? So I may have been drinking a little bit already during that day at that point, but I agreed to do it.
Uh-huh.
And I wound up playing in that banjo contest and winning it. I didn't have nothing else to do, and Bill invited me to go along and ride along on the bus.
Huh.
And he said I could run the merchandise table or whatever.
Oh, okay.
So I wound up doing that and we were playing, or Bill was playing up in Ohio somewhere up there. I remember my dad, I saw him coming all the way across the parking lot. I got off the bus and I had checked with the lady at the draft board down here. And she had told me, this is like in July, August, whenever I had, August maybe when I had my physical, that she had already had her call made up till the end of the year, and after that they went on the lottery system, you know.
Right.
So I thought I was good through the end of the year. My dad, I saw him coming across the parking lot up at that festival in Ohio, and I go out to meet him. And, you know, I got about 6 feet away from him. He said, you remember that physical you had to take last month? Yeah. Well, you passed. And he had me my draft notice.
Wow.
And so I called the lady up that was head of the draft board, and she said, oh, yeah, they had me, in my October call, I'd had to take 17 men that was going to do October, November, December, and they sent a rescission back. I only needed 14, but when I threw all the names back in the hat, your name came up at the top of the
Oh,
list.
no.
And, you know, so November 16th, 1969, I became a member of the U.S. military.
And you were stationed in South Carolina and got to know Snuffy Jenkins down there. Is that right?
Yes, sir. That's right.
Yeah. Tell me about your relationship with him. And you talked about how good of an entertainer he was and things like that in the book. Tell us about what kind of things you learned from Snuffy.
He was one of the nicest, funniest, most wonderful little guys I ever met in my life.
Yeah.
Don Reno's cousin Bill Haney had gotten me in through channels he had. He was a lifer down there in the military. He got me into special services.
Oh, okay.
And he also introduced me to a lady there in town named Pat Aarons. Her husband was, in those days, was a veterinarian, but she's the one that wrote all the books on Snuffy and Pappy.
Oh, okay.
And I actually met Snuffy and Pappy through her.
Oh, I see.
It was at Pickens at her house, and then I got to picking with them some. And then it got to the point that I'd go along with them, you know, when they'd go out to the VA hospital out there and play for the patients there in the hospital and stuff. I'd go along and I'd play the guitar till Snuffy would pick up the washboard, and then I'd get Snuffy's banjo and I'd be playing Alabama Jubilee while he was raking up and down that old washboard and all of that, you know. And I loved them. I thought they were the nicest. They were the funniest two people. Those two guys were acquainted for 57 years, and they were partners 55 of those 57 years.
Wow.
And on the weekdays, Pappy was the used car manager there at Central Chevrolet, and he was Snuffy's boss. But when they'd go out and work on the road, Snuffy was the boss.
That's
Because
interesting.
Snuffy didn't care about nothing but business. He'd show up at a festival, get his schedule when he was supposed to be there. 30 minutes before he went on, he'd be out back of that stage getting his garb on, all that little funny clothes he used to wear and everything.
Yeah.
He'd come off that stage, change his clothes, put his banjo in the car, go collect his money, and he was ready to go home.
Yeah. Wow.
And Pappy liked to socialize. He liked to get out and have a little nip out in the crowd every now and then, you know, and pick with some people. Grab that fiddle up and play, because he would play all the time if he had half a chance.
Yeah. Wow. And
Those were two of the most. That was two of the most wonderful years of my musical life, was being down there around those guys, because I learned so much. Was able to learn so much about how, you know, it wasn't all just about picking. It was
Right.
actually putting on a show for bringing folks out there, you know, and doing something that would get people to enjoy what you're doing out there, you know.
Right. And of course, Snuffy is part of the development of the bluegrass style banjo. I mean, he's in that lineage there. And you told the story about Smith Hammett and Rex Brooks and how they played the three-finger roll, and they had seen Fred Van Epps, classical guy, play with all his fingers. Tell that little story there.
Well, that's all there is to it. They had seen the Van Epps guy played with all the digits on his right hand.
Okay.
And you can hear him on YouTube out there. Just pull him up, some of the old stuff from 1925 that they got recorded on him. I mean, it sounds like, Norm McKelney and Jens Kruger and Bela Fleck all molded into one out there the way he played.
But he had come down south and they had seen him play?
They had seen him in a minstrel show.
Oh.
That had come through down there. And if you get a chance, if you really want to see Snuffy and Pappy and what all that old stuff was about, there's a video that was made called Free Show Tonight. And Roy Acuff narrated the thing. They put together an old medicine show, and I think they drove it in the wagons and everything into an empty field in Harris, North Carolina.
Okay.
And they got up and out and they set up their stage and everything, and they had the guys that used the cork on them and everything else, the blackface comedians and all of that stuff. But it's called Free Show Tonight.
Okay.
And it's on the internet out there. You can get it. And what was your question? I done drifted.
Well, we're just talking about the way the thing came together for the three-finger banjo style, and you said that Snuffy was the first one that actually put finger picks on his fingers, because I think Smith Hammett maybe played with bare fingers.
Yes, there was one of them, Smith Hammett or Rex Brooks, one of the guys who developed, if you play a lot bare-fingered, and I have done it, the ends of your fingers, when you start developing a callus on that right hand, it develops a hellacious little pain under it.
Okay.
And supposedly one of those guys wound up playing like Jerry Garcia.
Huh.
It was thumb, index, ring.
Interesting.
Rather, Jerry Garcia's middle finger was cut off on the right hand of his picking hand.
Right.
And that's supposedly how one of those guys did it. But anyhow, Snuffy told me that that's where he had learned that from. But Snuffy was the first one ever to do it who was a full-time entertainer. He was an entertainer by the time he was grown. Mm-hmm. That's what he was set, his life was set for him to do. Mm-hmm. And he was the first one to put on finger picks. He was the first one to play it on the radio, and he was the first one to record it with finger picks on.
Okay. And then Earl...
But he did not develop, the style. He was able to see other people do it before he did it.
Yeah, and then Earl and Don Reno saw or heard Snuffy do it?
Well, they were all within like a 50-mile radius down there.
Yeah.
That area in Rutherford County, North Carolina, or wherever it is down there where Flint Hill is. And Harris, North Carolina, and then right across the border there into Buffalo, South Carolina. They were all really close.
Okay.
I mean, whether they saw him in person or heard him on the radio or whatever it was, Reno was very adamant about the fact that that was the sound that he had heard that, he tried to adapt to the banjo.
Right. And
he was a guitar player. I
yeah.
mean, that was the deal. He was a guitar player that adapted to banjo. If you hear some of the early live tapes of Don Reno with Bill Monroe, he didn't have the fluid use of the fifth string that Earl had.
I see. And, Reno and Smiley had that television show in Roanoke when you were around that area, and you got to know Don pretty well, didn't you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when we moved up here, I'd been playing, I guess, about 2 years at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not quite that long. I think we moved up here in, I started the 9th grade up here, so 6, 57, 58, 59, 60, 61, 62, 60. I started school up here in fall of 63.
Okay.
And I met Carlton Haney not too awful long after that, and I'd seen Don and Red. The first show I ever saw had Flat and Scruggs, Mother Maybelle Carter, Bill Anderson, and Reno and Smiley on it.
Wow.
They took me to Spartanburg to see that, and Flat and Scruggs opened up the show. And when I walked through the doors, Earl was playing Flint Hill Special. He just started his show. And Mother Maybelle laid back to her when she came out. They took an intermission. Bill Anderson had a record out called Still. It was the #1 country record, but he didn't finish the show out. He was the first one on right after intermission. And then I saw Reno and Smiley, and I saw why most of the country artists who worked with them would not follow them.
Yeah. Well, they were great entertainers as well.
That was what Don got so much of that Snuffy had.
Uh-huh.
And when he had that old Leon Earl way of walking and the crazy ass face he'd make while he was doing it, while he was talking, he was one of the funniest people you'd ever see in your life. and the two of those guys were, I mean, here I was a 15-year-old kid, and I couldn't learn anything off of records when I was young.
Huh.
If I heard something that I wanted to hear, I'd just go out and find the person, and that was the thing about being so close to Don Reno up here. If I wanted to learn how to play Follow the Leader or Dixie Breakdown or something like that, hell, I'd just go up to their TV show. While Herb Sharp was doing the news, Don had sat over in the corner. Same way with Earl Scruggs. He taught me how to play ground speed in the back of the American Theater up here in Roanoke.
Wow.
Because I couldn't learn from their records,
Huh.
And I never did learn. And part of that was, it's enabled me to develop a sort of distinctive banjo style of my own.
Uh-huh.
The fact that I really couldn't copy anybody else very close.
I see.
I wasn't grateful for that when I was really young because I wanted to learn everything everybody was doing. But as I got older and tried to separate myself and design my own identity out there, I think it's pretty neat that I can't play like somebody else even if I try.
Yeah. Well, that's probably the best way to go.
It's amazing the way that I've seen music, acoustic string band music, change so much in my time from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I basically got out of it in the 80s. Terry Hay got me back in it to make those records that I made for the TV things, and I started thinking about the nature of organized sound. I once said that I only met two consummate geniuses the whole time I was in that realm of bluegrass music, and that was Bill Monroe and Bill Keith.
Uh-huh.
And their geniuses were as different as daylight and dark.
Yeah.
Keith's was always, was mechanical in nature. It had numbers to it. It reduced itself to a formula or a pattern or a cycle of fifths or whatever else it was out there. But he understood it on a technical basis. Monroe was just the unfolding of organized musical ensemble sound.
Uh-huh.
What key you playing that in, Mr. Monroe? He just slapped the accord out on the mandolin, that and right there. He couldn't even tell you most of the time what keys he was playing in. It was something, I've tried to look at talent like that. I mean, I've said in my video series that I don't think there were but two talents of that nature in the 20th century that I had sense enough or a chance to observe, and that was Bill Monroe and Louis Armstrong.
Yeah.
And the reason I made that statement was it's just damn near that everything that came along in the second half of the 20th century is directly traceable to one of those two careers right there. And I don't know whether it was because they were both so prolifically recorded. Because Louis Armstrong, he was recorded. Everywhere that he went, he was recorded.
Uh-huh.
And but it all just comes back to that to me.
Yeah.
It was all, my whole deal out there was just find out about that inner working of the music. How can you paint a picture with sound?
Yeah.
and trying to discover that. And then how do you make something? It's like I said, I've seen so much change come into music and string band music out there. And like what I'm seeing in this day and time with that young man Billy Strings,
Yeah,
they've got out there. I think he is the most dynamic thing to hit string band music since Bill Monroe. I swear I do.
yeah, he's
And
talented.
It's a different thing, but whatever it is that he's bringing to the table for these folks, he's sure making a lot of people happy with what he's doing these days.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, he's bringing them in. Now, you were famously with Monroe's band from late 70s, early 80s, and then you left. But later, you came back and you did a number of solo albums over the years, but this grounded, centered, focused record, you got Bill to play on that. Can you tell that story and talk a little bit about that experience?
Well, it was a thing that had come up. I tried for years and years and years. I went back out to Bean Blossom in the early 90s and hooked myself a deal out there where I went out and played all summer for him out there. Not for Bill himself. I played for James and other folks out there.
Uh-huh.
Just trying my best to get Bill to record for me,
Yeah.
And never did have any luck with it. So I got down there, I'd made a couple of records for Kerry Hay, and I did those under my band name, my Bluegrass band name.
Yeah.
I called it the Bluegrass Band. And I only did that because I owned the name. I mean, that was what I called it. I think that first incarnation of it with Alan O'Brien, Ed Dye, Blaine Sprouse, and David Sebring.
Uh-huh.
And Kerry wanted a name to put on this, and I said, just use my Bluegrass Band name. So anyhow, I made those two packages for him that he wound up selling on TV, and they did well enough for him, especially that first one that came out. When we had all the TV advertising on it, it provided funding for him to have a record label out there.
Okay.
So we got down in this. I worked with the Kazuhiro Inaba from Japan for him. I worked on a couple other projects for him, one of them with Willard Gayhart and some folks down here in Galax. And then he got some folks that were Stanley Brothers oriented and brought them into a studio. And I didn't care very much for that, so I decided I wasn't going to produce everything he brought from the door from there, but he kept on me to do a Butch Robbins album, a banjo album.
Okay.
So I put together this record, and I went to Nashville to record it. I had David Greer and Mike Compton. I'd called up a fiddle player who wound up not showing up on the sessions, wound up using a fellow named Jimmy Campbell who had worked with Bill because he knew some of these tunes.
Okay.
And on the parts that Bill didn't work on, I got to work with a wonderful fiddler named Randy Howard. Who was working with Kathy Schiavula back in those days.
Yeah, Randy was great.
He did some wonderful stuff for me. But anyhow, the second or third day into it, I was wanting to get into the fiddle stuff, and the fiddle player that I had contacted to do this stuff didn't show up, and I was scrambling around trying to get Jimmy Campbell to do it or somebody who knew these tunes, And I went out to Monroe's house one morning, and I said, Bill, I said, I've lost a musician or two out there on me. I need somebody to help me out in the studio. Why don't you come out and record with me this evening? Are you doing anything? And he looked around at Julia and asked her if he was doing anything, and she said, not that I know of. And he said, well, if nothing comes up, I'll be there.
Okay.
So I get to the studio. The sessions are supposed to start at 1. I got to the studio at noon, and Bill was sitting there in the parking lot. And we go in, and we start recording, and I had David and Mike there, and Mike Compton did the most wonderful, selfless job of sitting 3 feet in front of Monroe and playing right along with him. And Bill would lapse every once in a while.
Uh-huh.
And he was good for like 2 to 3 hours, but anything over than that, his mind would just wander. And so Compton was keeping him right on track with everything he was doing, and I wound up getting Buddy Spiker to come in and play the second part on the fiddle. He's real good with anything he does.
Yeah.
So he was able to make the fiddle parts be really, really good. Had everything else there. Mike Bubb come in and played the bass for us and everything, and that first day was just absolutely wonderful. And I just couldn't believe it. I was high as a kite that night when I got in. It took me like 1 or 2 o'clock to go to sleep. My phone rung at 7:30 the next morning, and it was Bill. And, Mr. Bill, how you doing this morning? I'm doing pretty good. Are you boys going back to the studio today? And the studio was booked for that day. And I said, well, what you got on your mind? He said, well, that music was awful good that we did in there yesterday. It might be good if we could do some more of that. And I said, give me 30 minutes. So I called up Vic Gabaney, or Kurt Story and Vic Gabaney, and Vic had a vocational class in a high school out there in Hillsboro Village, which was less than a mile from where the studio had been. And the studio there in that high school, he had equipped just like the one top of the hill where I'd been working in. So it was the same. We had the same equipment to work on and everything else. So I called Bill back in about 30 minutes, and I said, let's go. And he said, well, what time do you want to be there? And I said, anytime after 10 o'clock, you name it. And he said, well, I can be there by noon. And we went out and did it, and I got that second day. And I'm telling you what, my feet never touched the ground for 2 weeks after that.
How many tunes did you get him on?
I think I got him on 5.
Oh, wow.
I included the Kentucky Waltz that I did in there with him, but he didn't actually play on it.
Ah.
But I think I got him on, let's see, he had, what was some of them? I got 10 yards.
Golden West and 10 yards?
Yeah, the 10 yards I came back, I called Doug Hutchins that second night after I had the old man in there. Doug's the one that did all the Bluegrass Boys, belt buckles, and all this other stuff.
Okay.
He was the organizer of the Bluegrass Boys out there. And I said, Doug, I got him. He said, you got what? I said, I got Bill Monroe on the record. He come in and helped me with the record. And he said, did you get 10 yards? And that was the last one we had done in the second day, and he was really off on it.
Mm.
I must have spent $2,500 putting his tracks together from 3 different tucks.
Wow.
Right. But Doug told me that Bill had written that tune with my dad in the back of the barn at Bean Blossom.
No kidding.
And that's why I spent the money and took the time to make sure that got on the record.
Wow.
My dad would go up, I was telling you about him earlier. When he started going to Bean Blossom up there, somebody would come through and steal all the wiring out of the park every year because Butch wouldn't secure the park up there.
Huh.
So every year, my dad, who was an electrician, would go up there, and sometimes he'd pick up some of these young pickers around here who would want to go to Bean Blossom to go with him to help him drive and then help him. But they would wire that campground up there, run the electrical wiring in it the week before the festival started.
Okay.
And that was when Bill found out that my dad could do stuff like that. That's when my dad and Bill Monroe became great friends.
Oh, I see.
And they stayed that way. You know, I've been pretty much a derelict in my life. I was out for the wild ride.
Uh-huh.
But if I ever did anything halfway decent, the last musical show that my dad saw, I was standing at the right hand of his ultimate hero. And if I ever did anything good in my life, that was it right there. That was what I gave my father back.
Yeah, that's wonderful. One of the other stories that I like that I read years ago that you told this story in an interview that you did with Banjo Newsletter, and then you told it again in your book, is about when Bill Monroe and John Duffy were singing together, and you were singing the third part. And
the Berkshire festivals, and do you remember Nancy Talbot by any chance?
Yeah.
She was putting on a festival up there that she called the Berkshire.
Right.
She's working with some English guy now on crop circles and all that. Neat gal, she really is. But anyhow, Duffy came up, and they started clowning around, and Duffy grabbed his cowboy hat and stuck his baseball cap on Monroe and put on his cowboy hat or something like that. He was all the time playing grab ass somewhere or not. But we were doing I Hear a Sweet Voice Calling. And by that time, I had learned some of the third parts in all those things. And I got up there to sing between the two of them, and the two of them just standing up straight as they could be. They weren't leaned into any microphone, and each of them at least 3 feet away from that microphone. And I'm right in the middle of it, and I'm 18 inches to 2 feet away. I couldn't even hear myself. They were so loud. When I hear a sweet voice calling way up, where it went to that way up, in heaven on high, every movement on that hill stopped.
Wow.
Dogs stopped in their tracks. And Leon Russell told me about it years ago. It was called the psychoacoustic effect.
Huh.
That gets achieved. It's like what happens when you got 4 violinists sitting around in a circle. There's one spot right in the middle of all those guys, all those violinists that are in there. There is one spot where you can pick up everybody with the same volume.
Huh.
There's one spot that you can find in the middle of that happens. When you start forcing that sound in through it by making it louder and more powerful getting in there, something happens, and all of a sudden 2 and 2 equals 5.
Yeah.
It's like this synergetic thing that goes on when that happens. And when Monroe and John Duffy showed me that one time, it felt like, I was almost imagining I was seeing, you know how you look out over pavement in the summertime and see those heat waves?
Yeah.
Raising off of it? The air was shattering like that in front of me. And every motion on that hillside stopped.
Yeah, it's two powerful voices clashing right in front of you. It must have been incredible.
It was, I mean, to be able to just have moments like that just completely stopped, all space and time.
Yeah.
And I was able to have a few of those while I was in the music business. I was actually a part of a few of those that happened that way.
Wow, that's incredible.
I had records early on and everything, so there's a lot of things that I was able to contrive on records and everything, but to have stuff like that happen to you out when you're on a live stage in front of a live audience.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen very often, but when it does, it's something that'll stay with you.
Yeah, that's remarkable. I always love that story. Well, Butch, I don't want to take much more of your time, but before we go, is there something from that grounded, centered, focused record that you have Monroe on that we could listen to?
That's what I was saying. I think that Golden West thing is probably that you won't be able to get the sequence on because that would run you up 10 minutes or so in your program, I think, by the time you get all 3 of those on. But getting that Doing My Time, then the interlude with the mandolin and the banjo, and then the Golden West hitting like that. But I think just the Golden West itself.
Okay.
That's the one that I'm most pleased with. If I were to say this is as close as I ever came to contriving bluegrass music in a studio, that was it.
Okay. Well, that'd be cool to listen to then. Well, I'm gonna put that on here as we go out. But before I do, I just want to thank you for spending time with us. And folks, I really highly recommend that you go on Butch's website and click over to watch the videos that he did. I think they're each about, there's 4 or 5 of them. They're each about an hour and a half long, something like that. But it's well worth the time and effort to listen to those. And also, Butch's book is called What I Know About What I Know, The Musical Life of an Itinerant Banjo Player by Butch Robbins. And Butch, can they get that on your website as well?
Yeah, I think that's available on the website. I will add on the Radford University thing
Uh-huh.
that basically if you just type in Butch Robbins, the last name spelled with one B out there,
Okay.
and Radford University into a Google search, it'll come up for you.
All right. Well, again, everybody listening, I recommend that you take the time to watch that. If Butch really lays out his view of the history of bluegrass from, Bill Monroe's early days all the way up through modern times, and it's a real interesting historical perspective. And Butch has a lot of insights to share with everybody, and it's a really educational and powerful thing to watch. I really thoroughly enjoyed it, and Butch, I thank you for doing it.
Thank you, Dan.
All right, well, I'm going to let you go, Butch. Thanks so much for spending the time with us today on the Bluegrass Unlimited magazine podcast.
Thanks for your time, man.
All right.
I appreciate it so much.
So before we leave the podcast, let's hear The Golden West from Butch Robbins' album Grounded, Centered, Focused. Well, folks, that's going to wrap it up for this week's podcast. This is Bluegrass Unlimited magazine editor Dan Miller saying thanks for listening, and I welcome you to come back and listen to our new Bluegrass Unlimited magazine podcast released every Monday.